Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Before we commence the function today, a brief safety announcement during the event here at Stein Auditorium. TERI is Health, Safety and Environment Certified Organization. In case of any untoward incident like fire, evacuation is required. You're requested to exit from this auditorium through the fire exit gate nearest to you without any panic. There are 7 exit gates for this auditorium, 4 on the ground, that is right, left, and 2 main entrances. There is 1 exit on the stage and 2 exits on the balcony, which are also the entrances to the balcony. In case of fire, fire marshals will take position in the aisles and exit gates to help you evacuate. I hope you all are having a great time at the summit. Thank you all for joining us for the 22nd edition of World Sustainable Development Summit, India's premier platform for deliberating the discourse around sustainability and climate change. As we proceed further, it is my great privilege to host you all on behalf of the entire WSDS and TERI family. My name is Anushree Herde, and I'll be hosting you for this session on Towards Equity and Climate Justice. It's a privilege to have with us His Excellency Mr. Simon Stiell, Executive Secretary, UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. A round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. We also have with us Ms. Leena Nandan, Secretary, Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. His Excellency Mr. Nasir Ahmed, Minister, Ministry of Environment, Sri Lanka. Ms. Jennifer Morgan, State Secretary and Special Envoy for International Climate Action, Federal Foreign Office, Germany. She'll be connecting us virtually. Mr. Siddharthan Balasubramaniam, Senior Advisor, Climate Works Foundation. We also have with us Dr. Henning Wooster, Director, Initiative for Climate Action Transparency. And finally, Mr. Janos Pastor, Executive Director, Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative. With this, I would now request the chair of the session, Mr. R R Rashmi, Distinguished Fellow TERI, to kindly lead the proceedings with his remarks. I welcome you, sir.
Thank you very much. And once again, welcome to all of you to this very important session where we are going to discuss the evolving framework for the next COP. And there are many tasks ahead, of course. You know, we have begun the implementation of the Paris Agreement. That's at a very broad global level. We have many tasks ahead now under the Paris Agreement. Last year, we had a very important milestone touched, which was on the loss and damage. There is a broad agreement that we will need to do something about it. But even more importantly than that, while we have a global goal on mitigation, we don't yet have a global goal on adaptation, which is a very important challenge in the years to come, and for all the major, the vulnerable countries, the vulnerable communities across the world. And we are seeing the adverse impacts multiplying now because of the intensifying adverse impacts of the climate change. So it's an important issue which we will need to cover in the years to come. In addition, of course, the big question which raises its head every time when we see the gaps in implementation, the question of finance. Now we have a long-term quantified goal on finance which has to be put in place. While we still go on debating the $100 billion pledge and commitment and progress on that. And very importantly, the year 2023 is going to be the year of the Global Stocktake. The year, time really flies. We signed the Paris Agreement just about 7 years ago, and now is the year of the Global Stocktake. So what is it that we will be taking stock of? It's only the promises that we have made or actual implementation as well? And if there are any gaps, how do we cover that? So that is the immediate the element of the negotiation and the work ahead as far as the COP is concerned. But at a very broad level, I would like, since all of you are represent the international community and the major stakeholders. The two broad developments and the challenges which I see is that we are looking at multiple transitions in all the countries which are facing climate change impacts. We are making transition positively in some areas, but there are some areas where transition is extremely difficult, and the process needs to be, we need to enable the process to become just and to see that we are on track to meet the global goal, yet the other social dimensions, the other hidden and untouched dimensions are not completely lost sight of. The other issue which I think in the entire discourse and in the process of negotiating various issues, we will need to also think about how we can promote further multilateralism and the consensus driven process. Is the process going to be splintered in the years to come because of various pulls and pressures, or are we going to remain consolidated and focused in our efforts to achieving these goals? So I'll leave these thoughts with you and then request all of you to cover this maybe in your interventions, and of course the audience will have a number of questions and expectations from you, and we will have a time to visit those questions later. So with this, let me now invite first Mr. Simon Stiell, the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC Secretariat, for his remarks.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your introduction and the opportunity to engage with everyone here. And this is my first visit to India, and the 2 days that I have been here haven't been long enough to get a real deep dive, but it's certainly given me a deep appreciation of not just the challenges that this country faces. Let's place those to one side. But what I find inspiring and provides us with hope is the pragmatic approach that the government, the people of India are taking in terms of addressing these challenges, and the leadership that has been shown, whether that is in renewable energy deployment, whether it's ambitions to become a global hub for hydrogen, green ammonia, is certainly inspiring. Speaking to at a global level now, and what needs to be done, and the opportunity that COP28 presents us, is the delivery of the Global Stocktake. This gives us an opportunity to not only take stock, see where we are and where we're not, but it is about the opportunity to course correct. It is the response to the Global Stocktake that I believe has the greatest value. I don't think we even need to wait for that stocktake to be completed to understand where we are. Report after report has already been issued telling us we're far from where we need to be. So the value in the GST is how, as a global community, both inside the intergovernmental process, but also the role of non-state actors and the role that they take and the prescriptions that are required to get us to where we need to be in 2030, or certainly within the periods of the 5-year period, the next 5 years until the next stocktake. The opportunity to set a very clear path prescriptively as to what needs to be done, and what of those elements are pertinent for the COP decision, and those elements that are still pertinent that fall outside of that. But the GST, as well as providing us with that 5-year roadmap and course correction, needs to also be linked to the outputs of COP29 and COP30. So COP29 that follows will be a finance COP, the delivery of the new collective quantified goal for finance, where the billions are supposed to transform into the trillions, but answering that key question of means of implementation. And in every single negotiating room, every single negotiating element within the process, finance is the elephant in every clause and every negotiating room. So the means of implementation that are at scale, that address how action is to be supported is laid out. And then in 2025, COP31 is the ratchet, where ambition and the mechanisms for increasing ambition are to be delivered. So to come back to what is to be delivered in Dubai this year and the Global Stocktake, the platform for all that I have mentioned, the foundation, and that opportunity for that course correction is there to be delivered at the end of this year. There are two things that are needed. First, we're going through or coming to the end of the technical phase of that stocktake. But it is the following phase, the political piece, that requires elevation. And as we sit in the Secretariat right now, is not where it needs to be. And that can only be affected by the political will and the support of all parties. And in particular, in terms of moving the needle within the G20. And it is an opportune moment with India taking on the presidency of the G20 to push for that very strong signal, political signal, that comes out of the G20 summit in September that should set, again, that signal, that path for the ambition expectation for COP28. So we have a lot of work to do. Sat under the GST, we have, as was mentioned in the opening, the delivery of the loss and damage and the financing component for that, or certainly defining what those facilities should look like. Delivery on the global goal for adaptation, again, setting those targets as to how we need to elevate the agenda on adaptation. Continued work on the mitigation work program, and of course, the just transition work program. So the schedule, the agenda that we're working to this year and the subsequent years is a heavy one. The Secretariat has an important role to play in terms of facilitating this, but not just facilitating workshops and discussions and discourse, but really setting out what needs to be done to make sure the outputs of each of these elements is at the level and has the impact that is needed for this course correction. A lot of work for us, a lot of work for all of us, but work that's necessary to get us back on track. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stiell, for highlighting the opportunity that we will have at GST for correcting the course, if wherever there are shortcomings, and we all know where are the gaps. Thank you for pointing it out, and thank you for giving us the confidence that we will stay on course and we will be able to correct these shortcomings. Let me now invite Ms. Leena Nandan, who is Secretary, Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change of the Government of India. India being a very important player, and as Mr. Stiell was pointing out, the G20 chairman now. How do you see the issues of equity and climate justice, which India is highly very committed in the process of climate negotiations? How do you see we will achieve these goals in the process of GST?
Good afternoon to all the distinguished delegates and dignitaries and all the participants. I think Terry has put together an excellent summit, and this has come after a time when, due to COVID, a lot of our conferences had perforce to become virtual ones, online, and there is nothing that can substitute an interaction where we can talk and exchange views and deliberate on a series of issues that concern all of us. So I think this has been taken up after a bit of a hiatus and very successfully, so congratulations to Terry for that. And I'm glad to have been given this opportunity a little early on, because unfortunately I have to leave due to another commitment. But I would like to say that in this upcoming COP, what we do expect in terms of when we talk about equity and climate justice, it is specifically the focus on the global goal on adaptation. We all know that adaptation is something that concerns vulnerable communities, vulnerable societies the world over. And there are indeed countries, entire countries that are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And that is where the support is required, because that is what equity demands, that is what climate justice demands. And that, I feel, has to be the focus of the upcoming COP28. We have all along focused on mitigation. We've been talking about reduction in emission. We've been talking about the finances and the technology transfer, but that has not materialized. And therefore, if we keep focusing on what has not happened and relegate to the background at least something that is doable, quantifiable, and actionable, then we would have taken the discourse back into the very specific arena of action. And that is what I would think the COP28 needs to focus and hopefully will focus on. Because again, when we talk about climate finance, the very definition of climate finance is yet to be arrived at. The finance flows have yet to be seen. So instead of focusing on what might have been, let us look at what has to be done and work towards making that actionable and achievable. In India, while we do feel that as a country, having consumed far less than our fair share of the carbon budget, we have yet been taking enormous strides forward in meeting our responsibilities of growth and development, along with a focus on environmental sustainability. This is the country which made certain commitments in 2015 in terms of the NDCs, achieved them much before schedule, and yet has gone forward to scale those ambitions even higher, to set even higher goals for the country, all the while meeting the growth aspirations of a 1.4 billion population of Indians. And therefore, it is as a developing country that we say that we require the focus on adaptation. We require much more discussion on loss and damages and the mechanism for the loss and damages to actually be in place. Having taken so long to even arrive at mainstreaming loss and damages, let us not waste more time. Let us actually get the action onto the ground. This country has, in the recent budget, made a very sharp and concerted focus on the green push and green energy, green transition, green growth per se is the mainstream of our planning. And that is something that shows our commitment towards growing, but in a responsible and sustainable manner. We have also given a clarion call in terms of the lifestyle for environment, which is about mindful utilization of resources. And we feel that this is a thought that needs to resonate more. We are happy that it was part of the cover text of last year's COP. But how this can be mainstreamed, how every country within its own socio-cultural and economic environment can actually mainstream mindful utilization of resources is also something which we hope will find a place in the deliberations in the upcoming COP. So I would like to say that we have great hopes and expectations. We are already at the stage of global stocktake, and time has passed with most of us not realizing that the goals are far from having been met. But India is committed to doing more than its fair share, and we hope that that is the same spirit we will see from other countries of the world. Thank you for giving me this opportunity, and I will have to take leave, but I look forward to hearing of the deliberations and the way forward that would emerge out of today's panel discussion. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Secretary Nandan. Thank you very much for being with us and sparing your time with us. Your message is very important, and we have all taken note of. We will discuss it and let you know later. Thank you very much. Secretary Nandan was pointing out, I mean, I thought I must draw your attention to this point about the life, sustainable, she talked of mindful utilization of resources, which is actually the other way of talking about sustainable consumption. This is an issue which we really normally don't talk of in the climate negotiating process, but it's time that we start talking about it in the context of equity. Let me now turn to Minister Nasir Ahmad, Minister of Environment from Sri Lanka. So you are free to use the podium if you wish, but you are welcome to stay here. Considering the fact that Sri Lanka has been one of the key vocal participants in this loss and damage issue, and you are vulnerable as other major countries are, how do you see this? Mr. Stiell also referred to this loss and damage facility being a major goal of the next COP. So how do you see this outcome actually taking place either in next COP or later?
Fine. Let me use the podium and then answer your questions. Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. It is my honor and privilege to address once again this afternoon. Let me focus on two items. Of course, there are so many topics. We know every time we used to discuss in COP, we have already passed 27 years, going to reach 28. We don't know whether we will end up in 280 years. Still, we'll be talking the same subject. So that is where we are. But in this context, I would like to focus on two main themes, that is loss and damage and climate finance. COP27 will go down in history for heralding the dawn of climate justice by legitimizing the spiritual and moral dimension of the climate emergency in the form of a super fund aptly named Loss and Damage Fund for dispensing reparatory justice, though it vastly falls short of a Marshall Plan for climate vulnerable countries in the global south, where 80% of the world population live. My fellow crew members and passengers on this spaceship Earth, where is the sense of emergency when the justice in a mayday situation? Global warming has heated the ocean to an alarming level, and it is continuing. Yet, a proposal by India, supported by 80 countries, to phase down all fossil fuels was outgunned at COP27, which is destined to return as a flashpoint at COP28. Many have already started looking forward towards COP28 and establishing the steps needed to ensure that the next climate conference results in climate action on many fronts. This includes a number of key priority areas such as loss and damage, climate finance, just energy transition partnership, early warnings, global stocktake, global goal on adaptation, and food systems. As I said, let me briefly discuss a few of the key priority areas, particularly from climate vulnerable developing country perspective. One of the key decisions made at COP27 is to establish a loss and damage fund. The loss and damage agreement provided hope for many low-income countries that have felt the brunt of climate change. But it also left a lot of questions unanswered. The focus is now on how to populate the fund and how to disburse it. As one of the most vulnerable countries in the front line of climate crisis, facing large-scale biodiversity loss, Sri Lanka has recognized the need for greater collective voice for urgent, speedy, and equitable execution of the loss and damage fund. His Excellency, the President Ranil Wickremesinghe, believes that securing political visibility, equality, and transparency, and front row seats for a united global South to discuss and determine the quality, quantity, and accessibility of the loss and damage fund will be the acid test for rebuilding trust between the developed and the developing countries. Towards this, Sri Lanka would like to urge all international development partners to consider supporting the formation of the Climate Justice Forum for amalgamating and amplifying the conscience, voice, and existential interest of the like-minded climate vulnerable developing countries from the grassroots of the highest policymakers. The proposed Climate Justice Forum will exemplify the principles and best practices of 21st century statecraft and digital diplomacy and harness the power of Generation Z to ensure the science, not geopolitics, will drive how climate finance and the loss and damage fund should evolve and function to serve the planet from an ecological apocalypse. In her remarks of the COP27, at the COP27, Managing Director of IMF, Kristina Georgieva, said that investment needs for climate adaptation and mitigation are far larger than the $100 billion that advanced economies have committed to provide to developing countries. For adaptation, she said that we need to agree on a shared definition of what constitutes an adaptation measure versus a business as usual investment, and we need to agree on how we estimate investment fund. On the multilateral front, the high-income economies need to recalibrate international financial institutions such as the World Bank and double down on capital injection so that they can significantly enhance the quantity and quality of access to climate finance at the local government and grassroots level. Multilateral lenders should phase out conventional risk metrics based on the prevailing country credit ratings, indices, which are anachronistic and permissive of climate colonialism. By adopting and mainstreaming climate-smart risk metrics, multilateral leaders, international banks, sovereign wealth funds, and impact investors can unlock trillions of dollars worth of green transition opportunities worldwide that so many recent authoritative reports have revealed. The Global Commission on Adaptation, led by former Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, estimated that investing $1.8 trillion globally in 5 areas, all pivoting around and contributing to biosphere restoration from 2020 to 2030 could generate $7.1 trillion in total net benefits. There are other reports released by world-renowned think tanks and management consultancy companies such as McKinsey and company that have made data-driven estimates in the tens of trillions of the economic benefits of investing in nature as well as cost of inaction. In light of the magnitude of untapped opportunities for investing in nature and the calamitous cost of inaction, I take the liberty to moot before this forum the idea for the establishment of a first of its kind international development bank, which I am proposing to be called Biosphere Reserve Bank. Coincidentally, it sounds like Federal Reserve Bank. Why am I suggesting this name? Because climate finance is all about protecting and restoring the biosphere for future generations. I propose Colombo as the venue for the world headquarters for the proposed Biosphere Reserve Bank. As the historic host and headquarters of the world-famous Colombo Plan, Colombo, located at the democratic cockpit of the world, sharing a mere 15 miles long sea border with our great neighbor India, that has the most green transition ambition in the world, will be an ideal location for the proposed bank, in my humble opinion. I propose to submit a viable go-to-market roadmap within 6 months for the Biosphere Reserve Bank to the President-designate for COP28 UAE, Dr. Sultan Al Jaber, outlining the operational modalities, sources of fund, technical, quantitative, qualitative, and governance parameters for mainstreaming and integrating climate finance with conventional finance. It is my sincere hope and prayer that we all agree that the climate change is a moral and spiritual crisis at its core. The overarching goal of COP28 presidency should be to universalize biosphere consciousness and ecological citizenship as the rocket fuel for radical and accelerated overhaul and transformation of global economy and financial architecture. Global cumulative climate debt is a ticking time bomb. Allow me to conclude by saying that without scaling up climate finance on a biblical scale, with what is famously known in history as the Dunkirk spirit, we will only win the battle but lose the war. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. We can assure you that through Terry, we will be your ambassadors on your ideas of Climate Justice Forum and also the Biosphere Reserve Bank. These are indeed transformational ideas, and I hope everybody is listening. What you have referred to is this challenge of mobilizing finance for the purposes of climate, where we are still floundering. But what I noted from your remarks was also that you asked for a change in the risk assessment matrix Conventionally, the financial institutions, they apply this kind of risk assessment. We need to factor in the climate vulnerability there. So it's very important thought which you have flagged, and thank you very much for this. Since we are on the subject of climate finance mobilizing, let me now go to Ms. Jennifer Morgan, who has joined us virtually, the State Secretary and Special Envoy for International Climate Action, the Federal Foreign Office of Germany. Madam, Germany has been a leader as far as climate finance is concerned. You are also a very strong believer in the process of just transition. So my question to you would be, of course you are free to express your thoughts on any subject, but you can also touch upon in your intervention as to how you think the expected outcome on the long term, the new collective quantified goal on finance, how that can be achieved in the COP process.
Well, thank you so much, and it's a real honor to be here, and thank Terry for your leadership in bringing us together. And I had a wonderful visit last week to India. Clearly, I didn't time my visit accordingly, but it's great to be with this esteemed panel today. And I think maybe just to echo a little bit what Simon Stiell was saying, my visit really left me with a sense of dynamism in India, a sense of tremendous drive from the leadership, but also, I visited Chennai down to the local level of what's happening to bring sustainable development and solar energy to communities, the business community that's moving, and Chancellor Scholz actually arrives tomorrow in India, and our foreign minister will be there next week for the G20. So a big part of my visit last week was to really listen and to hear what are the priorities for India moving forward, and how can we deepen our own collaboration to pick up the pace and scale of the just changes that need to happen. So it's great to be here now to think about COP28. I think just maybe a couple of reflections, and I'll come to the finance question, because I think that's a key, absolutely fundamental this year. And thank you so much, Minister, for your ideas also, and was definitely listening and look forward to learning more about them, because I think we need transformational ideas right now. We see and experience the impacts that are happening so dramatically around the world, particularly hitting the most vulnerable every single day. And I think that's why the COP27 decision on the loss and damage fund and the whole mosaic, as it's called, around it was so important and was really a top priority for Germany, and our collaboration with the most vulnerable countries. And I think we have to make really significant major progress on that at COP28. I think we're very keen. I think if we all engage in that in a way that is thoughtful, that steps back and looks at, okay, this moment that we have to say what is already happening within different institutions on loss and damage, where are the gaps, particularly on addressing loss and damage, and how can we structure the governance of this new fund so that it can be driving those funds? How can it attract innovative sources of finance? I think that's part of the question there as well. And how can it be, we're setting something up for the long term. How can we do that in a thoughtful and pragmatic, but also ambitious way, so that we can make sure that the funds, first of all, are collected from countries, but also are really delivered to the most vulnerable countries and communities. And I think that's a key deliverable that Germany is, we're on the transition committee and we'll be taking very seriously and listening carefully there. I think the second part of my observation from my visit to India and also other countries is just indeed this dynamism and where the opportunities and the possibilities are coming together. And I think that's an important input. And I think, we'll have many conversations, I think, around the just transition going into the COP and at the COP. How do we achieve those transitions, knowing they're at different speeds to reflect, of course, the equity principles, but but also to try and work together to speed them up. And maybe just a couple words on Germany and our just transition kind of process that we've had. I mean, I think first to just talk about the importance of involving all stakeholders. You know, these pathways need to be just nationally and internationally. So nationally, Germany, you know, takes our responsibility quite seriously, and so have a 2045 greenhouse gas binding goal, and really, I think, have found in the last year that thinking all of these issues together about the well-being of our people and the planet, but the energy security issues, having had to phase out a third of our energy from Russia due to the Russian aggression, replacing that, being more efficient. I think the Prime Minister's Life initiative is really important to bring those issues forward. I know our experience, just as an example, one thing that we did was actually reduce the cost of tickets for public transport. And that's something the government moved forward. We were able to do that, and it really got people off the roads and into the public transport in a really effective way. That's just one example, and look forward to thinking more about the Life Initiative through the G20 and the G20 leadership. But I think, you know, our transition and building up our renewable energy, moving forward and working with others to do that, I think, and finding that at COP28, I think under the incoming presidency, who has the goals to be transformational and find these types of breakthroughs, I think that's something we're keen to share with others and see how we can make that happen. And finance obviously is a fundamental part of that. And I think, you know, it's clear that the 100 billion has to be met. It's also clear exactly what Kristalina Georgieva said was completely inadequate. And therefore, you know, we have to this year, and his honorable minister mentioned this, really reform the international financial institutions so that they are fit for purpose for this year, next year, and into the future. And I think that means looking at issues like risk assessment bases, looking at issues like debt, and how many countries are in severe crises still following on from COVID, looking at issues about how to actually bring down the cost of capital for renewable energy and use the balance sheets of these banks. I think it's a very big priority of Germany and other countries. Let's get real progress happening this year, and then going into the 80th anniversary of the Bretton Woods institutions, really get the reforms that we need. And I think the negotiations on the new collective quantitative goal have to fit that all together. Maybe just finally on the global stocktake and actually looking at the links to the outcomes of that stocktake, because I think that is the way we all know that we are far from where we need to be on mitigation, adaptation, and finance. The question is, what do we do about it? And I think the clarity around adaptation, and I heard that from the secretary, and the priority there of getting a goal that is meaningful, but also really drives local adaptation forward, because we know how important it is to be working locally on adaptation. So how can we be empowering local communities on that through that global goal? It sounds counterintuitive, but I think let's think about, let's get something moving on that. I think on finance, I've spoken about that. And I think on mitigation, you know, we need to do all of this at once. And without significant progress, or I would say a breakthrough even on mitigation, which we did not have at COP27. We had an inadequate outcome on mitigation at COP27. We, you know, the loss and damages will just be unbelievable, and the suffering will be massive. So I think having a clear outcome on that, indeed, I think the idea put forward from India of a phase down of fossil fuels, combined with a phase up of renewable energy with some clear targets, I think is one piece. We need to peak emissions as soon as possible, the IPCC says, by 2025, and drive from there downward. But the finance part of that and that just transition is absolutely essential. And I think Our experience here is that when we think these different things together, obviously noting the different starting points of countries and the different pathways, we can come out stronger and more resilient. And we need to be more resilient and move forward on adaptation. We need to be also incredibly ambitious in getting that half of global emissions in 7 years, with developed countries obviously taking the lead. So thanks so much, real pleasure, and look forward to hearing the other contributions.
Thank you, Secretary Morgan, for your thoughts. First of all, for reassuring us about Germany's continued commitment to mobilizing and assisting the process of raising climate finance at the global level, and also restructuring the international financial flows in a way that they help the domestic transition in different countries. And I also noted that you have said that the GST should be a comprehensive process rather than focus only on mitigation. So thank you very much for your thoughts. With this, we have come to the end of the round of the keynote addresses, the leadership address. I'll now turn to the discussants. I have 3 of them, and of course the time, since time allotted to us is a little brief, I'll request you to cover in your remarks the ideas that have just come up. But I don't want to again limit you with my thoughts. You are free to come up with your own perspectives on this. But in particular, for the first discussant, I would request Mr. Siddharthan Balasubramaniam to again, since he comes from the perspective of Climate Works Foundation, which is a philanthropic organization, how you look at this business of finance flows. And would you like to come to the podium and kindly look at the watch?
Thank you very much. And good afternoon, all of you. I was looking at to start the note on a serious note, when I was looking at the first thing struck me is how much hair I lost in the last 1 year, or how much Rashmi ji has still, despite it is being white. So that's the first serious note I want to start with. But to be honest, the COP business is a pretty serious business. A lot of people hate COP. And my friends, colleagues, skeptics say, when the COP will end? It's 28, 29, we're talking 30 years. Should we have a goal to end COP at all? That is a question also we should ask ourselves. The best way to do that is stop the climate change. The way the climate change stops, the COP stops, I will be laid off. It is not only IT sector could lay off, the climate sector is pretty secured. All of us are secured jobs because it keeps on going. So it is not a good thing. So at the risk of taking my job to the exit, I can say that if you want to stop COP, let's stop the climate change. That's the first message I want to give. There are some overall expectations. I heard all the speakers, including Simon, my big boss, my previous boss, Jennifer Morgan. Hi, Jennifer, good to see you in this context. My overarching expectation, despite getting into the details, weeds of the COP and the priorities, are threefold. COP28 should make real and tangible progress on substance, not just on process. I'm saying with the reason because it is not to just criticize our Secretariat or anybody. In fact, it is going to tremendously help Secretariat if the process is less, because the Secretariat staff work 24/7, all these here and pull these meetings, all sort of ad hoc working group, contact group, technical dialogues, seminars and meetings. So if we can reduce the process and focus on the content, and we should all help. That's the first message I want to give. I hope COP28 will make an attempt to it. Equity across all the items we talked about: mitigation, adaptation, finance and capacity building, and of course resources. I think that is hard to unpack, but each one of them has one equity angle. And that is one thing I hope the COP28 focus. I'll unpack a little later. There is a continued geopolitical shocks and setbacks, like what's going on in Russia, Ukraine, or China, US, a number of other issues, and economic stability as a casualty of the geopolitics. And COP28 cannot get over it, but I hope it can withstand, wither away the shocks and deliver and focus on the climate action. That's a third expectation from my side. I'll also hope there'll be less of rhetoric, less of divisive discussions, and more in the language of cooperation. It's easier said than done, but what's the harm in saying good things? So I take the liberty of saying, let's do it, if possible. And the important one is about the coordination, collaboration between COP presidency and the Secretariat, because that's going to be pretty important. We met the COP president, he laid out the vision. I was amazed at how proactive and welcoming he open to hearing all the voices, make the COP as inclusive COP. That always means work for the Secretariat. I look forward to that kind of cooperation, coordination, how to convert the vision of the COP presidency into real operation by the Secretariat. That's a broader level. In terms of finance, because I can't, everybody talks finance, I need to talk about it. And the challenge of finance, I was thinking on the way after hearing the speakers, the whole buzz about ChatGPT, it can answer anything. But I wish I asked a question to it, when, how much climate finance will come to the developing countries. My sense is it may say, I don't know. So literally that is a case of a situation here. It is complex. Or ChatGPT may cite 100 articles, 1 million subsections, and without any specific answer. So is the complex of climate finance. That's on the lighter side. The reason being, the 100 billion we talked about, people say, why we still talk about 100 billion? We should move on. Where we move on? If we move on, we'll fall into the cliff. Because the 100 billion is a bridge to what was promised and what should come. Since we haven't delivered the 100 billion, what happened was the billions gave babies called trillions now. And those babies are not small. The little is 2 to 4, 6 trillion to begin with, and all the way to 15, 16 trillion. So let's not ignore the 100 billion important it is important. That's the first point on the finance, I don't want to get into it. The reason being, if you break a promise, the saying goes like this, broken promises are like a broken pencil. It is pointless, literally. So let's keep the focus on the finance, deliver it. That's my first message on the finance. In this context, how we embed equity and justice element in the new collective quantified goal, it's a lot of acronym, NCQG, one more in the baby of acronyms, but that's very, very important. Because India made a submission on behalf of the LDMC, it is low developing, again, another acronym, on behalf of the developing countries, laying out what the countries want to see in finance, which is about the scope, scale, also how we access the finance, and how do we, the transparent mechanism to ensure the flow is happening, it is accountable. That is on the quantified goal. Next year should end, it should not keep on going. That's on the finance. Global Stocktake, next COP is pretty critical on Global Stocktake. What does it mean by that? We have to take stock of what has happened, very transparently, honestly, and what need to happen. And there is a fantastic submission by India and other developing countries and what they would like to see in terms of equity and element. The global goal on adaptation, just imagine how long it took. It just happened in Paris, but the process is going to happen many years from now on. I think we need to wrap up soon. Yeah, Rashmi, you got a signal, just the last one. In terms of priority from my side, I would say from the India point of view and the developing country point of view, food security, energy security, and how does it tie to the climate is very important, because getting not sufficient attention, I hope the current COP take into account and deliver on those promises. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Siddharthan. I noted that you talked of the concept of equity in the new collective goal on finance. That's very important. And of course, there are other broad issues. Let me now turn to Mr. Henning Wooster. Since you are heading this initiative for climate action transparency, how do you say this global goal on adaptation? Would you like to touch upon this issue as to how we can achieve this outcome in an equitable and ambitious way?
Thank you very much, and I'll speak from here and hope the microphone works. But it seems
yeah, it does.
So I'm really pleased to be here, and I'm once again experiencing a wonderful and really in-depth discussion on topics. And I think you're managing this very well, because we may have time for a discussion, which has been lacking a little bit for previous sessions. So I'll be short, and I do want to highlight transparency, because I think transparency is one of the aspects that actually connects most of the processes that will be prominent at COP28. And transparency is often seen as a technical issue, but it is actually a leadership issue. And if it's not recognized as such, it will not work. Transparency is the backbone of the Paris Agreement, and without it, the Paris Agreement is not going to function. So obviously, transparency is critical for the global stocktake. Without good data and sound information, the global stocktake cannot really deliver. I mean, of course, we all know, and we have heard it from previous speakers, that we can conclude that we are not on track in meeting the Paris Agreement objectives. But then, do we really have a good understanding of why not? What is missing? There are different assessments out there. There's not a common database to actually move us forward. We need to have much better data in order to address also the global goal on adaptation. And that comes to your question. I think at the moment, we are in a situation where we do not have the metrics, the data, the processes, the national databases in place to actually understand where we are on adaptation at the national level. How do you want to aggregate that? It's going to be extremely difficult to do that in a meaningful way. And that's where I'm saying you need much more leadership. Of course, everybody knows that we are very far from the resilience that is required, that the developing world is going to suffer in a 1.5 degrees world, and it will become much worse when we go beyond 2 degrees and whatever we are on track to now. But there is a need for much better basis to understand where we are, what is effective, and how it can be addressed. And that requires, again, a good understanding in terms of data. And the same applies actually to finance. So there we have the additional complication that the lack of finance is very much linked to a lack of understanding on how to advance on mitigation and adaptation. While we have an increasing recognition of the importance of adaptation finance and the need to incorporate it in the global goal on finance, the lack of data and the clear methodology is still problematic in moving us from that broad understanding to a very specific decision that can help to achieve this. It's quite ironic that the global stocktake comes a year before the national reporting round under the Paris Agreement. So maybe that could actually be an opportunity, because the global stocktake can, and in my view, must come out with a strong call on countries to get ready for their first biannual transparency reports in 2024. That will be a critical contribution, but of course, global stocktake has to do much more. It has also to be able to link to the action at the domestic level. And my response to ending the is that, in fact, the nexus of action has already shifted away from the COP to the national level. And that's where the implementation is. But it's good to come together every year and compare and compare experience in taking this forward. But this domestic level action, again, has transparency very prominently on the agenda. Countries need to understand their mitigation adaptation challenges. They need to be able to measure in order to be able to manage them. And many countries only now started to take ownership of their NDCs as they were starting to link them to national planning processes, national stakeholder processes. And let me also add a perspective on the equity part, which is, I think, very critical. Again here, domestic ownership is absolutely critical, both for equity, fairness, and then, by extension, for ambition. Without a clear and credible indicator framework for just transition processes, countries will not be able to ensure that nobody is left behind in their countries when they are implementing ambitious transformational action. And that, again, requires a strong and credible indicator framework, transparency on the just transition processes that need to be placed in front of action to be credible and make very transformative transitions achievable. The Global Stocktake, in my view, has an opportunity to make it clear that transparency is not only the prerequisite for global trust, but also essential for the domestic processes. And that, in the end, is also critical to understand where to allocate the financial resources. Without a strong M&E framework, investors will not be willing or able to engage at the scale that is required. But of course, that will not be enough to bring the Paris Agreement on track. There is a need for new impetus, complementing the bottom-up process of nationally determined contributions. So let me just add one proposal before I end. I believe that there's a lot of valuable action going on, and India is an excellent example in that regard. What will be needed is a framework to push countries towards such best practices in both mitigation and adaptation. For instance, by setting standards in those sectors where proven climate-smart practices have emerged as an option. That could start with renewable energy and energy efficiency on the mitigation side, and then cover early warning systems for the adaptation side. Again, it would require sound data and information to move this forward. So I'm not suggesting that transparency will solve all the problems, but transparency is the backbone of the Paris Agreement. And without transparency, the Paris Agreement is not going to be able to deliver what it was designed for. Thank you.
Thank you, Henning, for emphasizing the importance of transparency and, of course, the importance of data coming from the national levels, being aggregated at the global level to be able to support the other flows, the finance flows, the support, the ambition in our climate actions. And of course, you have also emphasized the importance of equity and the domestic ownership of equity. I think that is what you talked about. But it's important for ambition, both at the national level as well as global level. If we don't have the equity, it's very difficult to actually put this into practice. So thank you very much. I have the last speaker, Mr. Janos Pastor, the Executive Director of the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative. Mr. Pastor, I would request you to tell us what you think are the strategic priorities in the climate governance at the global level, and how do you see the future of the next COP?
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak on this panel. And I would like to respond to your question by sharing a few thoughts based on our work at the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, where we are, of course, seeking to catalyze governments to address risks and challenges that every government will face in the coming years, recognizing that these issues also need broad societal consultation and discussions. So the first point is that the #1 priority remains to reduce the risks of a temperature overshoot taking place by accelerating the pace and size of the massive and transformational emission reductions required, coupled with increasing removal of carbon from the atmosphere. Now, the UNFCCC process is rightly focusing on this, and it has to. And this is all about creating a long-term, sustainable, zero-carbon global economy. The world needs to build on, but substantially increase progress in this area. The challenge that we face, however, is that while this is happening, and the IPCC is very clear about that, is that now it's more likely than not that given current pathways, the world will heat up to a minimum of 1.5 degrees during the rest of this century. And the current warming is already causing catastrophic impacts everywhere, or in many places. And going to 1.5 and perhaps even beyond, you can imagine the consequences. And moreover, the Sixth Assessment Report makes it clear that at the same level of warming, the impacts are higher than previously estimated. So the second priority must be to reduce the risks from temperature overshoot. And this is all about risk management to reduce damaging impacts from the fossil fuel-based model while the transition to a zero-carbon sustainable model takes place. But this requires an explicit recognition of the likelihood of overshoot that is coming and explicit risk management strategies to deal with risks from such overshoot. And to be clear, temporary overshoot could mean decades, especially if the emission reductions and the carbon removals are not ramped up quickly enough before 2050. And when it comes to management of the impacts, there are two main groups of options to manage the risk from overshoot. First, the ones already being considered: adaptation, building resilience, and of course, paying for loss and damage that is already occurring. And then there is a second, which is considering emerging techniques such as solar radiation modification, or SRM for short, to cool the planet directly while the emission reductions and carbon removals sufficiently reduce greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. And the key will be to compare the risks of these two approaches, of a world that is using solar radiation modification, thereby reducing the temperature, but bringing new risks, and comparing it to not using solar radiation modification, but having a warmer, considerably warmer world and its impacts. And an additional challenge is that there is no comprehensive governance framework in place for considering, researching, let alone deciding about solar radiation modification. And the IPCC recognizes clearly that this is a risk by itself. Yet, governance is needed whether the world wishes to ban this approach and the technologies, or whether it wishes to make it work. Either way, one needs governance. And the question of explicitly addressing the temporary overshoot could come up in the GST discussions, and so might the different options to manage the overshoot. Therefore, one needs to be prepared on how best to manage these discussions, including to which extent a broader framework is needed for such a discussion. The issue of solar radiation modification has been and is increasingly on the agenda of many intergovernmental, including UN institutions and processes. Governments have the primary responsibility for addressing the risks arising from the lack of governance for this technique, and intergovernmental discussions and eventually decisions can address how best to use each institution and process for what purpose. We have the UN General Assembly, the UN Environment Assembly, the IPCC, even also the Human Rights Commission, the Convention on Biological Diversity, UNESCO, UNFCCC, all have roles in addressing these issues, but their roles are different and need to be understood and further explored. So then the question arises, what role should the UNFCCC process play in this area? The GST can be a start, a good start, looking ahead, instead of looking at now and the past, as Executive Secretary Stiell mentioned. So, looking forward, the GST can come out with some ideas about the concept of the overshoot and how to manage. And then thematic SUBSTA dialogues and other processes can help to build capacity to understand these issues and to deal with these issues in the intergovernmental processes. But given that the use or no use of techniques like solar radiation modification can have substantial impacts on global security, on health, on agriculture, and on overall development, and also on the health of ecosystems, consideration of the risks from overshoot and ways to manage them would need to be considered at the highest levels, such as in the UN General Assembly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Janusz, for this rather out-of-the-box thought on the frontier technology of the solar radiation and the need to arrest the overshoot. That, of course, is an important question, and we will certainly need to see how we address this question in the GST and at other fora. Technology, of course, has always remained a very tricky and controversial issue, and this needs to be managed very well and establish the right ways of climate governance so that we can foster these technologies and take them forward. Thank you very much for pointing to this very important question of the temperature overshoot. With this, we have come to the end of our discussions. In fact, we have already exhausted the time allotted to us, but we will still be open to any questions from the audience. We have about 10 minutes. So this lady here, is there a mic which can be passed around? Kindly introduce yourself and then mention the panelist to which your question is addressed. And kindly be brief with your question.
My name is Jayashree Nandi. I write for Hindustan Times. My question is to Mr. Simon Stiell. Is the 1.5 degree goal a lost goal now? What are you expecting from the GST this year on 1.5 degree? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question. No, it's not a lost cause. It is still there. We know that currently we are way off target. The science tells us where we are, but the same science and numerous expert groups tell us we also know what we need to do to get us back on track. What is clear is that time is running out, rapidly running out. So the urgency of action and the appropriate action is more intense now than it ever has been. The GST gives us that opportunity to course correct, as I said in my earlier intervention. How we develop and how we land the GST, I think, would be an important part in laying the foundation for that course correction. And again, as I said, it is the response to it that I think will be most important. And if it's one experience that I'm taking away from this visit here to India, is the amount of positive, forward accelerated work that is taking place in critical areas. And one of the elements of the GST is to look at best practices and how those best practices can be transplanted in other areas. So elevating, yes, identifying the gaps, but how we're going to fill those gaps is the opportunity that's being presented to us right now. Whether we take advantage of that opportunity will unfold when we all sit down in Dubai. But there is a lot of work that needs to be done between now and then to set that path, and then what takes place in terms of our response to that following.
Ambassador Puri here.
Thank you, Mr. Rashmi, and what an excellent panel. Mr. Stiell, let me congratulate you on taking over the Executive Secretaryship of the UNFCCC. I know you come with sterling credentials as a minister in your own country and from a country which has been invested in climate change. As someone who has spent years in the trenches in UNFCCC negotiations, let me try and take myself away from those trenches and not talk about overshoots, because this gloom and doom avoids the need to look at things which are positive. And I know, Janos, you have a certain technology that you want to try and push forward, and hopefully that will come through or not. But sir, to you and to Secretary Morgan, if she's there, I really want to know, what are we doing about looking at getting the private sector, especially in the developed world, to come to the conclusion that investing in green in the developing world is worth their while. The need of finances needs to be understood that it's not actually a macro problem. There is much more global savings than what is estimated as required, at least in the current times in developing countries, in terms of, let me say, to start the entire process and take it forward of greening their economies. Okay. So I really want to hear from you on that, because I see this as an opportunity and not as a problem. Thank you.
Okay. I agree with your framing that, yes, we all are aware of the challenges, and those challenges are bearing down on us. And that is attested by those of us who live in climate vulnerable countries. The role of the private sector and the role of private finance is central to achieving what needs to be achieved. Liquidity is not an issue. Global capital exists. It is the agenda that is now being set out, both for the new collective quantified goal, but the calls that came out of both Sharm el-Sheikh and out of Glasgow in terms of the need to transform the global financial architecture and the role that the MDBs have within that. The whole question of capital adequacy, the question of de-risking, the question of creating that environment where public finance can leverage the significant private finance that exists. So the conversation on this has been set out, coming out of COP27. Work is taking place now in terms of defining what those principles of finance need to be, which will be presented in Dubai later this year. And that, as I said earlier, is the platform that is set then for next year with NCQG. Political will is what will be required to address the financial architecture piece. And we've been caught in a cycle of rhetoric where shareholders say it's the role of the banking executives. The banking executives are saying it's the role of the shareholders. This year will be that moment to bring those two positions together. And again, as I continue to say, it is in the hands of many. But that platform will be set to see if we can move forward in terms of resolving, breaking this cycle as we work through this year and next.
Janos, would you like to chip in here?
Can I come in?
To respond to what Manjeev Puri said, I don't think it's the idea that there is doom and gloom or something else. I think we need to be clear, and I started my presentation saying we have to build on the success that we've had, and there are different ways of doing that. But while we're doing that, we have some additional challenges that we need to address. So it's not a question of this or that, it's both, and they're both required. And in that context, it's in that context that we are not promoting solar radiation modification. I think it's important to say that very clearly. What we are promoting is consideration, discussion, so that at some point evidence-based decisions can be made about it. Thank you.
Secretary Morgan, would you like to respond to this question of private sector involvement and the larger question of green finance, of course?
Yes, absolutely. No, thank you for the question, because I think it's fundamental. And I could just speak from the experience that we've had in Germany and in Europe, I would say. Because here, yes, we've started doing a lot of this because of climate. But actually what's happened, I would say, partially because of the new government, but partially because of the Russian aggression, which is, yeah, started 1 year ago today. You know, we've accelerated everything. And so you see the job creation that's happened. We've seen, you know, $10 billion worth of export of clean energy technologies. And the conversations I have now with companies here and also in Davos is more, okay, we are at this point where actually sustainable business, focusing on the products that are going to drive the zero carbon economy and selling those is far more profitable than continuing to produce and sell the unsustainable products. So I think your point is really fundamental. And I think that comes from a range of things. It comes from clear policies, both on the short term and on the long term, so that the signals are long, loud, and legal. German companies know with the 2045 binding climate law, you know, they have to move forward and produce green steel, but they're also doing it because they see the demands in the markets that are moving and opening up around the world. So, and those signals then also bring in the financing that's needed, but the conditions need to be, I think, right. So I think my sense from all of my travels, I mean, the pace and the scale is the key thing, right? That's not where it needs to be, and that's what we have to ratchet up. But I think more and more across the board, also on small and medium enterprises, it just doesn't add up to continue to do what's been done in the past. I think the whole point of integrating risk into decision making, whether it be of banks or within multilateral banks or private banks, and forcing, you know, bringing those decisions in, having just transition plans also for banks on to avoid stranded assets, but also to integrate into, you know, supply chain thinking, the impacts of climate change and what that means is a tool that is really important, and I think also could use more and more focus as well. But yeah, policy 2030 policy, super clear, and the clear targets out to 2050 and as binding as you can get, because then the direction is clear for companies to invest and then start creating the profit that they need, and I think the value creation in different countries all around. Thanks.
Thank you, Madam Morgan. We are really left with only 3 minutes now, so there is not time for perhaps just one, and at the most two. One question here, the gentleman here in the middle. A short one, please, and kindly be brief.
Sure. So this is Pranav Kumar Khedwal from University of Delhi. My question is about the climate justice. As we talk about the climate justice at that higher level, but what about the peoples of the root level? They only know the justice about themselves, they fight about themselves, they fight about their family and friends. They don't fight about the climate justice. How to just bring a sense of climate justice to them, that climate is also belong to us. We have to fight for us for the climate justice.
Can I request Mr. Stiell to address this question? Climate justice.
I wasn't sure there was I didn't hear the question, but the issue of climate justice needs to be at the heart of the climate negotiating process, and it is moving closer to the center. The opportunity, and I keep using this word opportunity in these difficult times, is with the Just Transition Work Program, which needs to be defined by parties, but it's an opportunity for developing countries to lay out the agenda as to what precisely that means. And I believe as we move forward, and again, coming back to the global stocktake, gives an opportunity to ensure that there is equity within that roadmap that moves forward, and the issue of just transitions is a central point along that roadmap.
Thank you, Mr. Stiell. And I think with this, we have come to the end of this session. And, sorry? Please.
Thanks, Rashmiji. I think the justice, the JEDI principle, what they call justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, it is not just about acronym, as we say. In Indian context, it is very different from others. I think one thing we are all learning in the process is how that concept apply to each context, and accordingly what measures we take. For India, it is about the space, the carbon budget, the space, legitimate space they need to have, so apply to other countries. Just want to say in this process, private sector is, they will be accountable. I think the process started in Glasgow, and hopefully COP28 will lay out what is a process accountable for the private sector as well. Also on the justice part, it is all about fairness. It's all about fairness. That is a simple way I interpret. Is it fair for a country which is just developing, multiple development versus somebody developed over the 200 years? So that's the way we interpret principle. Thank you.
Thank you, Siddharthan. So with this, we have come to the end. Thank you very much, and it has really been an exciting and enriching discussion. I'll use Mr. Stiell's word that GST is an opportunity for course correction. So hopefully in 2023, we'll see some correction of the course as far as the the unaddressed issues are concerned, the issues of adaptation, resilience, loss and damage, and the bigger question of finance, multilateral finance, the private sector finance, which is really the key to supporting and promoting transition at the domestic level and at the global level. So thank you very much once again, and let me thank all the panelists, my esteemed the guests and the panelists here, and thank you for your patience.
It indeed was a wonderful and enriching session. We now have a very special announcement, which is the signing of letter of intent between UNFCCC and TERI. May I request all the dignitaries except Mr. Stiell to please step down the stage.